task force and using President Biden's complete middle name. Otherwise, the amendment makes no substantive changes. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition? Johnson of Louisiana.
Speak on the matter.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's review the well-documented facts. Last September, the National School Boards Association and the Biden administration coordinated to send a letter requesting to treat parents at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. Yes, that is right. It's documented and it's a fact. The Biden administration thinks concerned parents who express frustration with radical policies governing their children's education somehow warrant counterterrorism resources. The NSBA and Biden administration letter infamously urged the government to use federal law enforcement to target concerned parents at local school board meetings and chill their protected First Amendment activity. One of the parents the NSBA cited in its letter is Scott Smith, who we've heard about today already. His only crime, so-called, was demanding that Virginia school board officials accept responsibility for the fact that his daughter was sexually assaulted in a school bathroom. New information from the NSBA shows that Justice Department employees coordinated with the White House directly, well in advance of sending that letter. And they likely knew and raised no concerns that the letter would urge the use of the Patriot Act to target parents. As a reminder, the Patriot Act, of course, we all know, was enacted after 9/11 to investigate and punish terrorists. Just 5 days after the NSBA's letter, Attorney General Garland issued a memorandum, and he directed the FBI and other Justice Department components to address a supposed, quote, disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence, unquote, at school board meetings. Of course, that disturbing spike was never backed up with any evidence at all. Thanks to whistleblowers, we now know that the FBI quickly operationalized counterterrorism tools against moms and dads. On October 20th, 2021, the FBI's counterterrorism and criminal divisions created an EDU officials threat tag. That was the threat tag that would be applied to all school board-related investigations. 2 days later, the NSBA issued a formal apology for its letter, disavowing its characterization of concerned parents as villains and withdrawing the request for counterterrorism resources. They were exposed, so they hung Merrick Garland out to dry. And to this day, Attorney General Garland has yet to rescind the memorandum. Given that the underlying basis for his order has been rescinded, we all have been wondering here, why hasn't the order itself? Parents voicing their concerns at school board meetings are not domestic terrorists. That's why we have the placards here. We have to remind our Democrat colleagues of the obvious. Given the Biden-Garland DOJ's track record of inviting news cameras along to kick in the doors of their political opponents, you can bet that if there was a single parent in this country who posed any real threat to any single school board member, we would all know about it. It would be constantly broadcast on CNN and MSNBC and the rest. So let's be clear. The request for counterterrorism resources has now been withdrawn, and there is no evidence that parents pose any particular threat to any public officials. And yet, Judiciary Committee Republicans have repeatedly called on Attorney General Garland to rescind his memo, and we've sent over 100 letters now requesting information and documents regarding the investigation and the use of that threat tag. To date, all we have received from the Justice Department and the FBI are half-page response letters and exactly 0 requested documents or substantive information. It is simply unacceptable for the Biden administration to continue using federal domestic terrorism resources to target American parents. The use of these resources chills protected First Amendment activity, as these parents now rightfully fear that their advocacy for their children could result in a visit from federal law enforcement. I urge my colleagues to join me in asking for these documents so we can finally get to the bottom of this administration's utter disregard for the rule of law. I remind my colleagues again, this is clearly within the jurisdiction and the very important responsibility of the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. Congress. This is our role. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank the gentleman. Well,
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, when Attorney General Garland went through the confirmation process for his current job as Attorney General of the United States, he made a solemn pledge to keep politics out of the Justice Department. I, for one, was encouraged by his statement, having seen the disastrous politicalization of the Justice Department under former Attorney General Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. Attorney General Garland said this. He said, quote, "I will never make a decision in the department based on politics or partisanship." I took him at his word. I hope we wouldn't see a return to the days when people saw double standards play out in the Justice Department based on who happened to be in office, who happened to be investigated. But clearly, under Attorney General Garland's leadership, the Department of Justice has pointed its arrows toward concerned parents, for example, who are exercising their First Amendment rights to speak up about their children's education. Attorney General Garland has sued the state of Georgia and the state of Texas, for example, claiming that ballot integrity measures that were within the prerogative of the states to pass were somehow suppressing the public's right to vote. We're going to start voting in about 50 days from now. That's the main election date in Texas. We'll start voting a full 2 weeks before that date, where without any reason whatsoever, you can show up and vote in person. 2 full weeks before the general election. Yet Attorney General Garland spins a false narrative that somehow the state of Texas is suppressing people's rights to vote. And then Attorney General Garland, I think, shocked everybody by authorizing an unprecedented search warrant on a former president and a current political rival, when less intrusive means and methods would have produced the same documents that they claimed to be after. Time to time again, the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland has taken aggressive actions that are viewed by the Biden administration as politically advantageous. For everybody else, though, it's a different story, that double standard. When Supreme Court justices are receiving death threats, including the interdiction of a deranged man who was out to kill Justice Kavanaugh here at the nation's Capitol, the Attorney General did not respond by taking appropriate steps to prevent that violence. In fact, he fanned the flames. Instead of protecting the justices, he chose to criticize them and encourage what amounts to irresponsible conduct on the part of people on the left. And now I'm concerned about the department's double standard in handling of the Hunter Biden investigation. The public reports are that the president's son has been under investigation by the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Delaware for a long time now. There's a lot, of course, we don't know, but reported leaks and evidence seem to show that Hunter Biden may have committed various felonies, including tax fraud, money laundering, and foreign lobbying violations. Despite the severity of these concerns, recent news reports have painted an alarming picture at the Department of Justice's handling of this investigation, silencing whistleblowers, downplaying or discrediting inculpatory information, prohibiting the Department of Justice and FBI employees from communicating with members of Congress. This does not look, sound, or smell like an impartial investigation guided only by the facts and the rule of law. Just across the street from here sits the Supreme Court of the United States. On the front of that court is the inscription, "Equal Justice under Law." There's no footnote, there's no asterisk, there's no exception for relatives of the President of the United States. Every American is entitled to fair and equal treatment and equal justice under the laws. The Attorney General must guarantee that Hunter Biden receives the same treatment as any other American who is under a criminal investigation. Not better, not worse, but the same. Today, 32 of my colleagues and I have sent a letter to Attorney General Garland urging him to provide special counsel authorities and protections to the U.S. Attorney David Weiss, who is leading the investigation into Hunter Biden. This is a critical step that the Attorney General can and should take to restore faith in this investigation and avoid even the appearance of impropriety. So I hope he'll honor our request, do what he pledged to do when he was confirmed, and keep politics out of this investigation, and in the process restore public confidence to our nation's most revered institutions. Madam President, on another matter, the migration surge at the southern border has been at a crisis level for a year and a half now. Coming from a border state with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, we've experienced a disproportionate impact of that humanitarian surge, as well as the drugs that have found their way into the United States as a result. This, after all, is part of a business model or plan by the cartels who get rich smuggling people and drugs into the United States. But just in terms of the volume of migrants coming across, we've logged more than 150,000 border crossings every month for each of the last 17 consecutive months. That's unprecedented and shocking. Alarm bells used to sound when illegal border crossings topped 100,000 a month, but we haven't dipped below that level since President Biden took office. In the last year, Customs and Border Protection has logged nearly 2.3 million border crossings across the southern border. Now, these records come with serious consequences for everyone involved. Our Democratic colleagues and members of the news media focus their attention on how this surge impacts the migrants themselves, and there's no question that migrants endure a brutal journey to reach our country. They typically pay thousands of dollars to travel with human traffickers, or coyotes as they're sometimes called, who are known to rape, rob, abuse, and abandon for dead their customers. Those who survive the perilous journey to our border still face serious dangers. These are people who come not through our legal immigration process, but want to jump ahead of the line of the people who are waiting, even though we naturalize about 1 million people a year in the United States. In June of this year, 53 migrants, including 3 children, passed away after being locked in a tractor-trailer rig on a 100-degree day in Texas. A horrible way to die. The Washington Post described it as the deadliest smuggling incident of its kind in U.S. history. Last month, 2 children died attempting to cross the Rio Grande and drowned in that river attempting to make their way into the United States. One was a 5-year-old girl from Guatemala who was swept from her mother's arms into the river. And just 2 weeks ago, Customs and Border Protection confirmed that another 9 migrants had died trying to cross the Rio Grande. Since last October, more than 750,000 migrants have died at our border. That does not include the ones we have not yet discovered, but will eventually discover as a rancher comes across the bleached bones of a migrant who's been left behind by the heartless coyotes. Migrants are suffering every day, and we can't lose sight of the humanitarian crisis. But the migrants aren't the only victims of the border crisis. They've chosen to try to enter the United States irregularly, other than through legal means, and turn their lives over to people who care nothing for them, but care only about them as a human commodity and how much money that they can make smuggling them in the United States. But migration surges have a devastating impact on border communities like the border communities in my state, in Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Over the last year and a half, I've visited our border communities several times and repeatedly have heard of the strain of this crisis, nonprofits who try to assist in a humanitarian way. The migrants lack the space or resources to care for the thousands of people entering our country every day. Local businesses try to stay afloat amid safety concerns and significant financial losses. Morgues have reached capacity due to the influx of deceased migrants. As we've discussed during a Judiciary Committee hearing last week, local health systems and emergency response services are stretched to the breaking. Last year alone, in a small town called Del Rio, Texas, 15,000 Haitian migrants showed up under a bridge. Can you imagine? A town of 35,000 people having to deal with trying to address the needs and treat these migrants in a humane way. Well, during the 2019 surge, Customs and Border Protection reported that it was on track to refer more than 31,000 migrants for medical treatment, compared with only 12,000 the previous year. Of course, the surge in 2019 pales into comparison to what's happening now as a result of President Biden's failed border policies. The number of migrants needing medical care today is much, much higher. The strain this places on local hospitals and public health systems not only impacts the migrants, but also the American citizens who live and work in these border communities. We all remember the strain on our healthcare systems during the height of the pandemic. Hospitals inundated with COVID cases made it more difficult to get care in the event of you were experiencing some other public or other health emergency. As Brooks County Sheriff Martinez wrote in his testimony in the hearing we had last week, ambulances that ordinarily would respond to emergency calls from local citizens are now diverted to answer calls in remote areas, to answer the needs of the migrants who are experiencing a health emergency, reducing the medical services available for the local residents who actually pay the taxes that support those services. The impact of this crisis on border communities in Texas is not a consideration for the Biden administration. They simply don't care. Or, frankly, most of my Democratic colleagues here in the Senate. We heard from the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the senior senator from Illinois, complaining about the terrible state of our broken immigration system and what's happening now as migrants are being bused to places all across the country, including Chicago. But he's the only one who can convene a markup of legislation. Our Democratic colleagues have a Democrat in the White House, a Democrat speaker, and a Democrat majority leader in the United States Senate. Yet we've not seen a single piece of legislation offered or passed to try to deal with the crisis. It's always somebody else's problem, or it's just a political issue that you flail in the run-up to the coming election. Migrants are arriving in someone else's backyard. What do you care? Inundating someone else's public health system along the U.S.-Texas border and filling up somebody else's morgue. Apparently, the Biden administration doesn't care. And I haven't mentioned the 108,000 Americans that died of drug overdoses last year alone. Virtually all of those drugs, including the 71,000 Americans who died from synthetic opioid or fentanyl overdoses, virtually all those drugs come from the southern border. The precursors come from China, they come to Mexico, where the cartels get rich, shipping their poison into the United States. And then it's distributed by criminal street gangs, like the same gangs that are responsible for the dozens and dozens of shootings that seem to occur in a lot of our major cities on a weekly basis, including places like Chicago. These gangs who distribute the drugs that kill Americans fight for market share. They fight for territory. Yet our Senate Democratic colleagues who have been in the majority now, who control both the Senate, the House, and the White House, have not offered a single piece of legislation or a single response. In Texas, because of our proximity to the border, we don't have the luxury of ignoring this problem. Our communities are somehow expected to absorb and care for this vast humanitarian crisis, even though they don't have the resources to do so, even though it is the federal government's responsibility. International borders and immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility. Yet the state of Texas and taxpayers in the state have spent billions of dollars to do the job that the federal government simply refuses to do, and even then are overwhelmed. It simply is unacceptable for our Senate colleagues or members of the House who haven't lifted a finger to deal with these problems to say, well, this isn't our problem because it's not happening to us. Well, that's why maybe, just maybe, the fact that migrants are showing up in Washington, D.C., in New York and Chicago seem to be getting the attention of others who previously have not lifted a finger or expressed any concerns whatsoever. By the way, the Biden administration has been shipping and flying migrants into the interior of the United States for the last year and a half. I mean, you haven't heard a single peep. But when they start showing up in relatively small numbers compared to what's coming across the border, the mayor of Washington, D.C. declares a crisis. She asks for the activization of the National Guard. Since April, roughly 9,400 migrants have arrived in Washington, D.C. I mentioned 2.3 million have showed up at the border. But now when 9,400 migrants arrive in Washington, D.C., a self-described sanctuary city, the mayor cries out for help from the federal government. She declared a public health emergency. Well, I mentioned the total number, but an average of 6,000 migrants cross the southern border every day. And yet, the mayor of Washington, D.C., a self-described sanctuary city, is in panic when 9,400 come to her city. The Border Patrol's Rio Grande Valley sector alone sees almost an average of almost 1,400 migrants a day. Over the last 5 months, D.C. has absorbed the same number of migrants that the Rio Grande Valley sector sees in a single week. And the city is crying out for help. The way the mayor really could help is to pick up the phone and call her friends in the Biden administration and say, we need to do something about what's happening at the border. That would be a constructive thing to do. We're more than happy to work with our Democratic colleagues to come up with some solutions, like the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act that I introduced last year with a Democrat, a border state senator, Senator Sinema, Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from the 23rd Congressional District, and Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, Texas. We offered this bill as a bipartisan, bicameral beginning to come up with a solution. Yet we've not heard a single peep out of the Biden administration. You would think, with the president's poll numbers plummeting as a result of his failure to deal with this border crisis, they would be looking for some way out, somewhere to land that plane. But they've not reached out at all. They've not responded. And Democratic leadership in the White House, House, and the Senate have taken zero actions. I'd just like my Democratic colleagues to pause for a moment and think about the communities in my state that have been operating at crisis levels since President Biden took office more than a year and a half ago. We are the ones, and they are the ones picking up the federal government's slack and managing a crisis, or trying to, that our Democratic colleagues refuse to even acknowledge. My constituents in border communities in Texas and beyond are exhausting resources paid for by their tax dollars to serve their own communities, spending them on the federal government's responsibility. And it shouldn't be any surprise that they're exhausted, they're overwhelmed, and they're desperate for the Biden administration and the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate to do something. Maybe, just maybe, now that this crisis has caught the attention of the mayors of Washington, D.C., and New York and Chicago, maybe the administration will pay attention to those mayors when they've ignored this problem so far. Maybe, just maybe, they'll see that what's happening along our border every day is dangerous, unsustainable, and a problem that we need to work on together to address. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence for quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
In a statement released through his Truth Social account, former President Trump responded to Attorney General Merrick Garland's brief bombshell press briefing this afternoon. President Biden's AG called for a release of the search warrant that led to an FBI raid of Trump's home at Mar-a-Lago. Garland also confirmed that he personally approved the decision to seek a warrant which led to the raid. In his statement, Trump claimed, quote, "My attorneys and representatives were cooperating fully, and very good relationships have been established," adding, quote, "The government could have had whatever they wanted if we had it." Trump then said, quote, "They asked us to put an additional lock on a certain area. Done. Everything was fine, better than that of most previous presidents. And then out of nowhere, and with no warning, Mar-a-Lago was raided at 6:30 in the morning." Trump closes his statement by stating that, quote, "They got way ahead of themselves. Crazy." This runs somewhat counter to Merrick Garland's statement, in which the AG intimated it was not the Justice Department that had made the raid public. Garland stated, quote, "The department did not make any public statements on the day of the search." Garland added that, quote, "The former president publicly confirmed the search that evening, as is his right." The 45th president has long maintained he is being persecuted by entrenched left-leaning partisans in the Justice Department and federal law enforcement. His critics contend that he has engaged in potential criminal activity both before and during his presidency. In his statement, Garland defended his actions and those of agents and prosecutors as untainted by politics and infidelity to equal justice under the law.
I think I should start by saying I agree with you. It's pretty inconsistent for any person to abhor the defunding of local police and suggest defunding the FBI. We've got to make sure that the FBI is doing what FBI should do, and that takes resources. Another thing I think that I have pointed out during August on this whole issue is that everybody maybe thinks about from top to bottom that there's problems in the FBI. I never hear from Iowans about the dozens of FBI agents that we have working the grassroots of the Midwest, that there's any problems there. But I think there really are problems at Central FBI that we have to work on. And we should have extraordinary confidence in the FBI, and I think they've lost a lot of their credibility and this isn't just the recent incident that you referred to, Mr. Chairman. This is over the last maybe good part of a decade anyway, some things that have gone on, mostly related to the two words political bias. In regard to today's meeting, we've requested that the judicial nominees on the markup for the first time be held over. We can vote on two U.S. marshal nominees on the agenda. I want to refer to one of the nominees that I've had close working relationship with, Rich DeZino, who served as my chief counsel for national security and crime. I'm happy to see that his nomination to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board is receiving a vote today. Having served in the Justice Department, he knows that the government has a duty to its citizens. The government has a responsibility to protect fellow Americans. He also understands the need to protect civil liberties and privacy. I'm also confident that Rich understands how to work in a bipartisan and nonpartisan way. He did it repeatedly while working on this committee, and I think it's important that he'll bring that ability to the board. I want to say a few words on some of the bipartisan bills that I've worked their way through this committee and through the Senate. First, this committee has discharged the Eagles Act and is currently on the hotline to pass the Senate. I've worked with the parents of victims from the Parkland, Florida, with the attorneys general of 40 states, with 10 Senate co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, and with a bipartisan team, including Representative Deutsch and Diaz Barrett in the House to move this bill forward. The bill will give the Secret Service the resources they need to help organizations who voluntarily request training on the signs of when a person is mobilizing towards violent or interdict them, and particularly if they require mental health care. It's long past time that the community organizations, particularly our school districts that want this training, finally are able to get it so that future tragedies can be prevented. I hope this bill will pass the Senate soon. Second, with Senators Feinstein and Schatz, I've led a bill to expand cannabis research. This bill has passed the Senate and now the House with a few revisions, and I look forward to it passing the Senate again and becoming law. The Senate passed 2 House bills during Police Week before the beginning of the last recess. One was the House companion of a bill that I co-sponsored with Senator Ossoff, giving resources to police to deal with victims of traumatic brain injury, but the House has not moved on the 4 pro-police bills sent over by the Senate after being voted out of this committee. That includes a bill that I led with Senator Coons to help police combat PTSD, and one that I led with Senator Cortez Masto to fund small police departments, as well as another 2 led by Senators Cornyn and Whitehouse. We've all read the news reports that some House members don't want to see these pro-police bills move forward. I hope that these reports are wrong and that the House will soon do us the same courtesy as we did them with their bills and pass our Police Week bills. Lastly, I sent a letter to Attorney General Garland about his memo about members of the Department of Justice almost saying don't correspond or don't communicate with Congress. The timing of that memo is quite suspect. It came on the heels of the whistleblowers approaching Congress. You read about my participation with those whistleblowers and getting some changes made, or at least making public some changes. One person retired or fired as a result of it. But this memo failed to mention that we have 2 whistleblower protection statutes that his memo would be either having a chilling effect on whistleblowers doing what they should, or maybe stopping it entirely. Memos like this can chill whistleblowers, and that ought to be considered unacceptable by everybody in this committee. Whistleblowers are patriots. They expose government wrongdoing that we wouldn't otherwise know anything about. And I think I proved that we got some very favorable information from whistleblowers that were at least able to make some small changes in some of the things that the FBI does that's wrong. I yield.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for being here. Could you pull that mic closer to you, please, sir?
I'm sorry. Is that better? Yeah.
Yes, sir. General, I think the Justice Department is losing. I think you're losing on crime. I think you're losing on drugs. I think you're losing on immigration. I think you're losing on Chinese espionage. Let me start with crime. What percentage of cops in America do you think are bad cops?
Very small percentage.
Like how small?
I don't have a number. I think the
Well, you're
most
the
police
country's chief, one of the country's chief law enforcement officers. Is it
but-
less than 10%?
Yes. Let me just be clear. We believe that most police officers follow the Constitution in their practices. Most police departments do, and all police officers, I believe, want to work in police departments that follow constitutional policing requirements.
Is it less than 5%?
I don't have the numbers. I think it probably is, but I don't have any numbers for you.
Okay. Do you think most cops are racist?
No, I do not.
What percentage of cops do you think, in your judgment, I know you can't give me an exact figure, do you think are racist?
I'm sorry, I'm not resisting because I have a number that I can't give you. I just really, I don't have any way of making that evaluation.
What's your gut tell you? Less than 5%?
One thing I've learned is to not give answers from my gut.
Right. Well, you think it's less than 5%?
I don't know the answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. You don't know?
I don't know, no.
Okay. Why doesn't the Justice Department support stop, question, and frisk?
I'm not sure what stop, you mean stop and frisk? Is that what you mean?
Some call it stop and frisk.
Look,
Terry v. Ohio.
Yeah, I don't know that the Justice Department has a position. This is a state and local role normally. Look,
Do you think it works?
I'm sorry?
Do you think stop, question, and frisk works?
I think in some circumstances it can work, but of course it can be abused.
Right.
Yeah.
But why doesn't the Justice Department aggressively encourage law enforcement officials to use that technique? It's been declared constitutional, as you know.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has affirmed the constitutionality of stop and frisk. That's in the Terry case. That's exactly right. But we don't do that. The federal government doesn't do patrolling. This is work for patrolling.
I know you don't, but you're one of the country's chief law enforcement officials, maybe the chief, and what you say matters.
Well,
suppose here's what I'm asking. Let's take Chicago, where we haven't made any inroads in stopping the killing. I mean, Chicago is now the world's largest outdoor shooting range. We know that a lot of the shootings come from gangs. Why wouldn't you want to call the police chief and the mayor in Chicago and say, look, you know who these gang members are. When you have reasonable suspicion under Terry v. Ohio, an objective standard, more than just a hunch, why don't you aggressively stop, question, and frisk these gang members? You'll get guns off the street, you'll get drugs off the street, and you'll get a lot of gang members off the street, and you'll stop people killing each other. Why won't you do that?
the best way for the federal government to stop violent crime is to work at each local level and determine and let the state and locals determine what the best use of their own
Judge,
resources
I'm sorry for interrupting
is.
you, but I'm trying to get some answers.
I'm sorry.
Why won't you do that? Just tell me why you won't do
Because-
that. Your
because-
opinion matters.
Because there is no one solution fits all that the federal government can suggest to state and local law enforcement. We believe state and local law enforcement knows best as to what to do there. We provide
It's not working.
We provide our technical expertise. We put lots of resources into joint task forces. We
Well,
pick
General,
up.
is that, I know, I've got to shut this down. I've only got 15 seconds. Is that why you're asking in the middle of a raging inflation for 7% more money, $2.63 billion to provide technical increase, or technical advice? I mean, we're going backwards here on crime, General. You're the state's or the country's chief law enforcement officer, and you won't even answer my question about how you feel about stop, question, and frisk. Why should we give you more money?
It's a resource allocation issue for each local police department. I believe that the Justice Department does the best by putting the money that we're asking for is increase in law enforcement that can be assisting the state and locals.
But General,
in the
is
best
that what
way.
we're supposed to tell the mothers of those kids getting killed in Chicago? You don't understand. It's a resource allocation issue.
No, what you're supposed to tell the mothers in Chicago, and what I told them when I was there, was the Justice Department was there to provide all the resources that this subcommittee will give us to stop violent crime.
But yet
the
you
more
won't,
resources
won't
you
try
can give
to
us.
stop, question, and frisk.
That is a question for the state and the local, for the state and the local law enforcement.
I didn't go over as much as Manchin did, Madam Chairman.
That's not the standard by which we judge behavior.
Thank you, General.
You're welcome.
Mr. President,
The senator from Iowa.
thank you, Mr. President. All the Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee sent Attorney General Garland 2 letters about the Justice Department's involvement in local school board matters. The first one was in October. Then in December, we asked why the FBI's counterterrorism division was getting involved in parents expressing their concerns at school board meetings. Now, just to be crystal clear, there's no excuse for real threats or acts of violence at school board meetings. But if there is such threats, these should be handled at the local level, and the Attorney General should withdraw his memo that started this whole thing off. Well, a couple days before Christmas, the Justice Department responded to us Republican members of the Judiciary Committee with a single-page letter. In that letter, the Department of Justice had nothing to say about why the FBI's counterterrorism division was involved in local school board matters. The Department of Justice just simply said, quote, "We're not going to withdraw the memo," end of quote. So, the feds may be keeping track of school board meetings, even if it creates a horrible, chilling effect at those meetings, and maybe even discourage people from coming to those meetings. And of course, the FBI looking over your shoulder would then have a chilling effect. Now, next week, the Senate Judiciary Committee will hold a hearing on domestic terrorism. And I hope the committee will be focusing on the serious threats facing our country. And I hope no one thinks the focus is going to be on our nation's parents. School boards have to be accountable to the parents and the taxpayers that they serve. Some school boards across the country are still shutting down classes, even though vaccines have been available for a long time, and dramatically reduce the chances of major illness to teachers. Meanwhile, millions of kids across the country are struggling to catch up. They're under enormous stress from being separated, one kid from their friends in the classroom or in the school building. Schools are seeing far more behavioral problems than they ever have before. Parents, then, are right to be concerned about these situations in their local schools. And it is their right to ask questions. They should be telling their school board districts that they want to see changes. But will they see changes? Or will they be afraid to speak up at school board meetings? Will the FBI's counterterrorism division be keeping track of them as parents ask for changes from their school boards? The Department of Justice owes the American people a better answer than just a single-page letter that says nothing about why the FBI's counterterrorism division is involved in local school board matters. Now more than ever, parents should be their kids' strongest and the kids' best advocates. They have a God-given right to do so. And of course, the Justice Department ought to be doing everything it can to protect that constitutional right, not scare these parents out of exercising their constitutional rights. Attorney General Garland then should withdraw his memo, and he should take Congress's oversight and concerns for parental rights more seriously. Then on another matter, Mr. President, and the last issue I'm going to speak to, I want to visit with my colleagues